Yep,
All
it's
right,
good.
perfect. And can you guys see the slides well too?
Yes, it's good.
Perfect. Well, it is wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation and for all the people involved in organizing this meeting, especially to Kim Walker, to Mark, and to Matthew Johnson. And thank you all of you too for joining us today. Some familiar faces, and it is wonderful to see and to meet many of you. I'm planning on speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes, and I am very much looking forward to the conversation afterwards. So, my talk today, and in this, I'm trying to kind of draw from work that I've been doing during the past decades, including material that I have examined in my books and in other pieces. But also, and I am very glad to see here Mackenzie Cooley, with whom I have been in conversation during the past months about several kind of ideas about where to take, how to move forward with the histories of Material in the Atlantic, and what are the ways of thinking about that. And that is what I wanted us to do today, to reflect a little bit on what has been done, and some possible avenues for continuing that exploration, both in terms of published material, in terms of the examination of primary sources. And the way I'm framing some of this work is rather than speaking about a history of medicines properly. And I'm sorry, I have turned this on, but I'm gonna somehow turn off again. I'm just using the closed captioning here, and I hope this works out. Here we go. So instead of speaking about histories of medicines or histories of pharmacy properly, I thought it would be useful to think about, at least in the context of the early modern 16th and 17th century Caribbean, which is my area of research, to think about substances with bodily effect. And very obviously, I'm using this term in an attempt to walk away from historicist, what I believe are historicist ways of framing a materiality that is just far more complex than just being part of that history of pharmacopeias or European or Euro-American context for thinking about medical substances. So, true, many of these objects and substances could also heal, but many of those actually could kill, and they did so. Not They didn't work under Euro-American parameters, and neither did they work under what we'll think of as quote unquote African parameters for explaining the works of these substances. And I think the reason for this, part of the reason I believe the Caribbean is such an interesting space historically for thinking about medicine and materia medica, is that the Caribbean was a place of innovation, of brutal reimagining of the world. It was not a space for reproduction of African, European, or Amerindian, for that matter, Morris. And I think even these terms are really poor for describing the multiplicity of cultures and re-engagement with the world that appear in these spaces. And here in the map, we can see the constellation of cities, small villages, and maroon settlements, among others, that comprise the rich world of the 17th century Caribbean, including two of its largest cities, Cartagena de Indias, and I hope you can see my cursor here in what today is Colombia, and Havana here in the north. All of these little towns and villages, and what I'm pointing out here, again, these are some of these are towns. Some of these are actually places like El Limón in the Montes de la Maria, or Matudere, actually spaces of black settlements that were, even by the late 17th century, in many ways independent from that quote unquote Spanish colonial project. So, in other words, I'm calling these the Spanish Caribbean just for the sake of convenience, but it was places where Spanish, or for that matter, British or French, only in the imagination of people in the metropole. They were far more cosmopolitan and far less kind of bounded by orthodoxy that what we will like to believe, or what many histories of these spaces will let us to believe. So most of these places, by the way, do not appear as central to the history of knowledge making of the 17th century. And indeed, historians have, in many cases, engaged the Caribbean as a sort of tabula rasa, one that could be reimagined and rebetted both historically and historiographically for analysis of commodities or wealth production, natural history, or the discussion of African cultural and social continuities. And in histories of science, the Caribbean appears as a place of collection or of tasting, a place of position, and for the deployment of the famously racialized scientific models of the early era. So Caribbean inhabitants, in many ways, and again, by the late 17th century, most people in the Caribbean were of African descent. So most of these inhabitants appear as unwitting collectors or test subjects, or as carriers of forgotten knowledges that were absorbed in Euro-American sources. And I think this has been naturally a part of the ways in which historians have focused on both the histories of medicine, the history of pharmacy, and the histories of science in the early modern era, and the specific analytical models and objects of a study in which they focus. And by no means I am saying that this is not an important aspect of that history. And I'm going to be talking about this in a second, thinking about how the projects of natural history, natural philosophy, or the colonial explorations actually pushed away these knowledges, substituted them, and made them a kind of appropriating as being an essential part of that examination of the histories of science and the violences that it perpetrates. But I think that there is more to this, and this is what I'm hoping we can discuss today. So, and here I want to shout out, and I'm so glad that Mackenzie Cool is here, because some of these images are part of a project that she is leading, and in which together with her students and several other scholars, they're trying to think about how it is that we can make use of existing sources, right, for the histories of both Materia Medica in the broader early modern era, both in Europe and in my case, I'm interested, obviously, in what can be said and done in the early modern Atlantic world, and specifically in the early modern Caribbean. But that project, and I think this is a way of thinking how we can conceptualize and theorize something that it is not as localized and is not Euro-American in nature, also it includes this list of medicine sources related to medicine and substances with bodily effect coming from Asia, from Africa, and again, from the Americas. So just a shout out to what I believe is a very, very important work that she is doing. So when thinking about the documents that we have to examine the history of pharmacy in the early modern Caribbean, most historians resort, for good reason, to documents like this one. This is the Tarifa General de Precios de Medicinas. This is the general kind of charts for medicine prices that is credited to one Francisco Tenesa, who was a physician doctor of law from Spain, from Valencia, and which represents some of the earliest known print lists of medicines in Cuba, at least official lists of medicine in Cuba. Tenesa was also the protomedico from Havana, and many of you will know that the protomedico was in Iberian and Italian context, an authority that was in charge of the regulation of the kind of legal practices, orthodox practices of medicine, surgery, and apothecaries in early modern, again, Iberian and Italian cities. So in other words, this is somebody who is at the helm of the control and the orthodoxy of these practices in the region. So if one is interested in the history of substances with bodily effect in the Caribbean, one would look at like this one as an authoritative and legal compendium of all the medicine identified, classified, and authorized by people like Tenesa. And again, working in Havana, one of the two most important places in the Spanish Caribbean, and more broadly by the 18th century in the Caribbean such. This approach, however, focuses on a type of Euro-American records that portray what in appearance might be a dominant early modern American culture. Uh, and for me, we can derive analysis that depend on these labels, labels that we know very well that have been at the center of historians' analysis of these practices. So ideas about center, periphery, spaces for the kind of processing of knowledge, most of those in Europe, ideas about orthodoxy or not, legality and illegality, what is learned, what is not learned, what is quote unquote magical, what is religious. In the list, we can also see several substances that are recognizable to many of you, I hope, like the VSOR and many sort of Materia America that were circulated around both the Atlantic world, but in also in a global space by then. So it's also a way of thinking about the circulation of these substances, kind of in a global manner. So we can glean what is available in the island and how Havana and Cuba and the Caribbean was a space that activity and a space for the processing and taxonomization of practices from around the world, space of commerce, and there are many very interesting things that we can do with this list. But I hope this is not controversial anymore. We know how well this list, the one promulgated by Teneso, obscure what I think is a recognized larger universe of substances with bodily effect that were circulating not only in Cuba but in the Caribbean and in the Atlantic. And the role of these substances, they obscure the role of how these substances are part of a larger and darker history of colonialism, as many historians have, like Londa Schimber, among many others, have explained during the past decades. For instance, the list that I just showed you from Tenesa pales in comparison to a far larger one. And I don't have time to go in detail into the list, but this is a list that comes from the pharmacy of the Jesuit College in Cartagena de Indias, in what today is Colombia, which was arguably the largest pharmacy in the Caribbean during the 17th and the 18th century. The largest one and the one that compiled, right, like, and kind of in a more broader way, the global explosion in the circulation of Materia America, the 18th century. And I will be happy to talk more about this list and the work of the Jesuit College and Jesuits in creating both the list and kind of moving outside of the mercantilistic controlling spaces of both the Spanish and the Portuguese empires, and in many other spaces independently in the circulation of these substances. But even the Jesuits had a limited view of what circulated in the Caribbean, and this is I think, looking at different kinds of sources, it is very revelatory, and especially the Jesuits have a very limited view, at least in what transpires of what people of African descent, again, the majority of the people living in the Caribbean century, were dealing with. So partially this is because control was a fiction, right? Like, in the Spanish context, supposedly crown authorities maintain a tighter and direct control over both what circulated and what's available in the marketplace. But this could be not further from the truth, and the historical record shows that what appears both in the list of Materia America that apothecaries circulated in the Spanish Empire, not only the Caribbean, but this is more broadly speaking in the rest of the Americas and in Spain itself. And what appears in the list of the Jesuits is just a fraction of all the materials that were available in these spaces. So these lists, we have a list of medicine, for instance, that slave traders in the region used for their captives working in mines and plantations across the region. And we see examples coming from Panama, from Suriname in the 17th and 18th century. And in these, we see a variety of substances of either Amerindian or Afro-descendant origin. They appear only as entries in these records, but there is much more that can be done to explore this world, the world that are signaled, that is signaled in this, but seems to be like very terse and some mentions in records like, again, like this, a list of pharmacies of Dutch enslavers in Brazil in the 1649, or Spanish enslavers in Panama in the also in the 1620s, in the early 17th century. There is much more to this world. The multiple individuals and institutions in charge of crafting lists of medicinal substances in the early modern Atlantic, like this one published in Cadiz in 1622 by Juan Borja, shape a relationality to nomenclatures that were designed for denying ideas about belonging, value, organizational, and intellectual hierarchies. They do through the active creation of multiple others. Many people have also explored in the literature. So these documents are evidence of a type of colonization of knowledge that obviously hide the intellectual and physical world of entire communities. But even this well-known type of analysis might be limiting, especially if we're interested in seeing how these substances work outside of biomedical or scientific project. And I think there is a lot of value also, I have to say, in identifying how many of these substances end up not only being part of material medicals, but also later part of extractive projects, right? And I think those projects, again, signal specifically to the violences and the conflation and the ways in which capitalism, globalization, extractivism, and the erasure of knowledge-making practices of indigenous populations around the world ensued. But I think there is something else here that I think is at least as interesting. Similarly to Europeans, people of African descent, people of Amerindian descent, and Creole practitioners of all origins were interested in similar process of classification, creation of hierarchies, borrowing, adopting, and obscuring these substances. In other words, I'm interested, and I've always been interested in how practitioners in the Caribbean use these substances and appropriate them and create worlds around them. So it's a history of medicine and material medica, or medicinal substances, of substances with bodily effect that does not depend, that does not revolve around these colonial projects. These practitioners search for materials with powers of the body and explore the natural and social landscape of the Atlantic to imagine myriad of therapeutic and diseasing arsenals. The curiosity, artifice of the others of the Atlantic, which were very much interested in this process, puts them, I believe, in the company of a larger community that was preoccupied with the secrets of nature and how to make use of them for very material purposes. And there are indeed plenty of rich sources that closely describe the beliefs, ideas, and languages and strategies for creating knowledge related to the natural world that people from the Caribbean, living in the Caribbean, made in these usually forgotten spaces. The inhabitants of the world that people like Tenesa, the proto-medical, which I started the talk, wanted to codify, were mostly people of African descent that have been living there not only as enslaved people, but also as free blacks. This is what's true of the majority of the people living in the Spanish Caribbean by the end of the 17th century. The ones that they inhabit, by and large, do not appear in classical, traditional histories of science, medicine, or pharmacy. And I think that their words were alien to our own existences in too many ways to enumerate them. But they are also, I think, powerful reminders of what humans can do, the creativity they can draw from to survive and create in spaces as violent as the world of slavery of the early modern era. So the history of people like Francisco Pinga, Leonor Sape, Diego Lopez, or Bernardo Macaya, just a few of the 17th century producers of knowledge of African descent that I work on, was one of torrential creativity that did not depend on the usual trappings of encounters, hybridity, of mestizaje, or on those of catastrophe or erasure that have framed many of their history. More than anything else, I think that these histories are profoundly humbling. So how is that they persisted and built, stay with the toll of their times? How did they refuse to be consumed by a world, by a world that was designed precisely to do that? So in the rest of my time, I will briefly introduce a handful of these practitioners and describe some of the ways in which they engage with substances with bodily effect. These Black Mohanes, to use one of the terms that the 17th century Caribbean people used to describe knowledge makers, I believe they led an epistemological revolution in which the experiential replaced first principles as the basis for creating knowledge and truth about the natural world. And this term, Mohan, that you can see here, record coming from the early 17th century, is a word of Amerindian origin that Amerindians in the region throughout the Andes and the northern part of the New Kingdom of Granada use to invoke numinous and terrestrial powers and hierarchies and people that master these powers and knowledge about the natural world. So let me just show you a little bit of the spaces in which they work, and I'm going to be focusing, just for the sake of time, in the city of Cartagena, again, in the New Kingdom of Granada, what today is Colombia. And it would be a mistake to imagine a space like this as a highly structured and certified healthcare marketplace, or a place where apothecaries and pharmacies actually rule what kind of substances Material America was being circulated or used. Unlike predominant narratives at the center of most histories of Black healers, the early Caribbean place where African healers and healers of African descent found that the rites and languages would be really intelligible. They will be relatable to most inhabitants and clans. So the best course of action was not to really recreate European or West Central African cultures of healing. Instead, it was a process of creativity, of incorporation, and of empiricism, as I will talk about in a second. Just a word of clarification: plantation life is what many people think when they're thinking about the Caribbean. Did not yet define the existence for most people of African descent in the region. I'm talking by the middle of the 17th century. Many of the people that live in spaces like Cartagena were first-generation Africans. Some were actually born in Europe, other in Africa. They were actually enslaved, what they call bozales. But many of them were also free, and they even captive themselves. They could and did indeed buy their freedom and navigated these social and cultural spaces through the practices that I am about to describe. The kind of history and social and cultural intellectual mobility and possibilities that the Caribbean offer is evident in the history of somebody like Paula de Guiluz. Paula de Guiluz was one of the preeminent health practitioners in the Caribbean. She even was the healer of the bishop of the city. And I will be happy to talk more about this history in the Q&A. She will be transported. She was finally imprisoned at the end of her life by the Inquisition, most likely after the denunciation by fellow competitors. And she will be even brought to heal the Bishop of Cartagena, Pérez de la Zarraga, when she was in the prison herself. She was by then 72 years of age and had been in Cartagena already for 2 decades. She has first caught the attention of the authorities in Las Minas del Cobre in eastern Cuba, where she was born, before being deported to Cartagena to face trial. She from Las Minas del Cobre here in what today is Oriente in Cuba, eastern Cuba, moved to Havana after being purchased by an enslaver. And then from there, she went to Santo Domingo. She had lived in Santo Domingo, in Hispaniola, in San Juan de Puerto Rico, in Santiago de Cuba, and Havana before ended up in Cartagena, paradoxically, because of her Inquisition process. But the fact that the bishop, Cartagena's bishop, resorted to Paula was not a matter of last desperate resort. The bishop, after all, could pick up among the hundreds of practitioners in this cosmopolitan city that contemporaries call the finest port in the Indies. A city that prides itself in having the best physicians and surgeons from all the globe and the finest hospital in the entire Caribbean by the early 17th century. The San Sebastian Hospital, one of three in the city, received patients from all over the Atlantic and cured more than 2,000 people annually. So here in the map, we can see how a map of Cartagena and Cartagena's spaces of healing would look if we were thinking only in terms of kind of orthodox spaces of healing, like hospitals or convents, which are signaled by the blue dots. And this is a very schematic map of the city, just for the sake of convenience. If we actually think about like all the spaces that I've been able to find in records related to healing practice of people of Amerindian or of African descent, you see that the space is far, far richer, far more populated, and do not only encompasses what happened within the walls of the city itself. Many of the spaces of healing are happening outside of the walls and also in public spaces, private ones. So the reason why I believe La Sarraga, the bishop, Paula de Glus, was because, and there is no other way of putting this, one of the foremost experts in matters of health in early modern Cartagena. And the success of Black health specialists like Paula and the prominent position that they acquired in the healing marketplace made him a threat to the credibility and process of other health practitioners. And I think this is the reason why so many of them ended up being in front of the Inquisition. As Central African Mohan, Domingo Congo, and here you have the Inquisition record from Domingo, said, the doctors, quote, the doctors of Caracas, in what today Venezuela, are my enemies because I cure patients they cannot. The power of African healers in the region is evident all over the documentary record from these spaces. And one of many other examples in Cartagena, including the Spanish friars, resorted to the West African healer Francisco Arara from West Africa when they did not receive any benefit from the treatments of their physicians. Like Perez de la Sarraga, like the bishop and other Cartageneros, Atlantic people of all origins inhabiting this world, for Caribbean health practitioners did necessarily ask for exploring and experimenting with new therapeutic alternatives and incorporating them into their own explanatory frameworks. Antonio Congo, an enslaved person from West Central Africa, for instance, spent his day in the forest around Cartagena looking for new cures. Domingo Congo, whom I just mentioned, the enemy of Caracas doctors, declared that he also experimented with plants that he found in the tropical forests around Caracas. In his cure, he used chicken leaves, crosses, and some red powders called barkisi. Diminutive and loquacious black figurine adorned with chicken feathers repeatedly helped him find the elements necessary for his rituals in the countryside around Caracas. And you can see here a very similar therapeutic tool in this watercolor depicting the ritual tools of an 18th century West Central African ritual specialist. Testimony of the long and deep transatlantic and African diasporic nature of the therapeutic inspirations of Caribbean healers. Similarly, Mateo Arara, a ritual practitioner from West Africa, and who in all likelihood was a priest of high rank in Ajada, in the kingdom of Benin, where he had been kidnapped, had specific methodologies for exploring and classifying the natural world and human diseases that he had learned from his masters in the old world, his teachers, I mean. In 1651, Mateo appeared before the Inquisition tribunal in Cartagena, facing charges of being a Mohan. Witnesses declared Mateo used an escobita or an esterita, a little mat, then opened and closed by itself when he asked a question. He, with the aesthetic, experimented with all types of herbs and counter herbs to ascertain what types of treatments would be useful, and these are his words, to heal Christians. As he explained, quote, after arriving in this kingdom, I have made from my wits a little mat out of palm leaves, which I tie by the ends. In its upper part, the little mat is divided into arms. And the mat, Mateo said, was a tool he made in order to recognize what worked or not for Europeans. And Mateo was not the only practitioner testing medical substances. Another Black practitioner named Juan Ingles in the record, Juan the Englishman, experimented on himself and on patients with plants like the herb Santa Maria and other animals that he found in Cartagena's countryside. In 1689, he declared that a colleague gave him several elements against poison and several roots and bird feathers that he experimented on an animal. Juan Diaz, another free Black born in the island of Madeira, in the Atlantic island of Madeira, also experimented with medicinal substances, with treatments that he tried on himself for the same kind of pains that his patients suffer. Among the roots and plants discovered and experimented by 17th century Black Caribbean ritual specialists and recorded by the Spanish scribes during their trials, in many cases through the intervention of African translators, we have the ones listed here: the Berbera, Ariajua, Guano, Granjo, Carcó, Orejón, Bullón, Escobilla, Tuauta, Cayaya, Patailla, and what we know was an abortifacient, Rompesora suegue. Besides these plants that have not able to correlate to contemporary taxonomies of herbs and plants, I found descriptions of Black healers' uses of tobacco, achiote, lulos, palm hearts, and bottle gourds, which could be found both in Africa and in the Caribbean. And this is what I will be happy to talk more about this, and I'm curious about your questions. These plants, I believe, did not uniquely or mostly function on the basis of explanations related to what we'll consider today ethnobotany. I think that their power is not one that can be or should be uniquely explained or mainly explained through their pharmaceutical kind of physiological properties. Instead, I believe their power resides elsewhere. This power resides in other sorts of ideas and practices and understandings of the world in which they became specialists. But those ontologists and those epistemologists, and this is what is also crucial to understand, I believe, they also depend on what the rational, experiential engagement with the world. These are not only cultural, religious manners of engaging with nature. This is a parallel history of also transformative techniques and engagements with the materiality and what it meant being alive. By the end of the 17th century, ritual practitioners like Mateo Arara and Domingo Congo have developed ways of understanding the natural world that were clearly based on experiential procedures that they devised on epistemologic spaces outside of European-led projects. And this can be seen in one of dozens of examples in the case of the enslaved person Juan Alomera, who appeared before Carthage Inquisition in 1696. He said that he was from Mozambique, on the east coast of sub-Saharan Africa. When examined by inquisitors, Juan did not know how to cross himself or recite Catholic prayers. He also did not know how to read or write. And I'm mentioning this to understand that even in these spaces, again, of post-Orthodoxy, most people did not live their lives under Catholic or Christian parameters, and that includes most people of African descent. Juan officially worked as a muleteer and was over 40 years of age when, on October 3rd of 1696, he was captured in his enslaver's farm. During his first audience in front of the Inquisition, Juan said that he had experimented and developed sophisticated diagnostic and therapeutic methods for treating ulcers, dysentery, respiratory problems, and other ailments with roots like the palo de fraile and cañoco. Roots, by the way, that also appear in some material medical compilations, like the ones that I show you before, lists of enslavers, pharmacies, coming from the northern UK in the early 17th century. Inquisitors interrogate Juan about the nature of his cures, rites, and procedures. And they ask him specifically if he believed that the sticks and the leaf that he had described for the cures and diagnostic procedures had what they say was natural virtues to cure. To this, Juan answered that he believed in the natural virtues of the herbs and that the basis for this was that, quote, he had made experiments in himself and another blacks, including the Mandinga black, and that these herbs had cured him. The inquisitors were mystified and proposed to them. Juan also argued that he only believes in virtue of the experience that he had had with himself. And that because of this, that he knew that these sticks, branches, roots, leaves, and powders had a virtue to heal. Any person with the same circumstance, because they will have the virtue to excuse and preserve from said spells or infections. So basically what he's also arguing here is a sort of universality for the cures that he is experimenting on. The inquisitor were furious and said that he should stop and recognize that he was failing to speak the truth. And Juan, undaunted, proclaimed that his conscience was clear and that he knew nothing of demons or magic. He instead reiterated that he had used his cures because as it has been helpful to him, they should all be helpful to others. So this is really, really interesting. And I think that in many ways, what Juan Alomera is doing here is articulating the revolutionary principle behind these Caribbean ways of the world and using substances with bodily effect. He made clear, as hundreds of his peers did in similar testimonies, that he did not believe that the part of his cures or diagnosis was based on Catholic or African principles or dogma. He also contended that the only valuable type of knowledge was that which stems from experience. This is remarkable. We need to remember that the universalism of disease and bodies in general comprise one of the major elements of the whole transformations in most thinking about the body that came from the work of anatomists, pathologists, and European natural philosophers that were contemporaries of Juan Alomera. As it is the case with Alomera's story, one of the things that struck me the most as I worked on these sources is that they provided details that in the seeming mundanity reveal so much more about how people in the early modern Caribbean understood and dealt with life. And this is also something that I need to remark upon. If you're really interested in a history of Materia America or substances with bodily effect in the 17th century Caribbean, the history that we should be looking at are the histories of people like Juan or Domingo Congo or Paula de Glus. They were actually providers of these substances for the vast majority of people living there, rather than the histories of people like Tenesa, the proto-medico of Havana, who's rich and the possibilities of accessing these materials were very limited for most people living in the Caribbean at the time. And this is true of the history of the region until pretty much the 20th century. So, and I'm just wrapping here so we can have time for conversation. So let me conclude by stating that I hope that the kinds of improvised commonality rooted in the bodies that I examine in this talk reflect how methodological approaches for the study of these spaces can be. So in these spaces, radical claims and practices and technologies, the claims that the people of African descent, these Mohanes, are making, really are engaging in radical ways with the material, political, and social worlds of the time. These are not stories that belong kind of as ways of dealing with a materiality or with a world in which they could not engage with. And I think this is crucial in thinking about the histories of Materia America and substances with bodily effect, that they are at the center also of histories of politics and science, of the world that exists, a world that is always dependent on the flesh and is possible. So, in other words, that the terms that we use, how we understand, carrying with them not only intellectual hierarchies, but also meta references to current discourses and epistemes, and also they carry a physicality felt history of violence. In other words, that these are not only technical discussions or matters of epistemological intervention, but also recognition of the broader and larger histories that are behind the materials that we use. So Black Mohanes' positions of power over the natural world were based on new ways of hierarchizing control over nature that was based on making visible, tangible, and sensible their own reality. So it was also in the Sierra de la Maria, in the towns of Nuestra Señora de la Ascensión, in Cartagena, in Tolu, many of the spaces that I examined in my research, where the fragile certainties of the New World were birthed. Caribbean ritual specialists defined not only the world that could be experienced, but invented a powerful and lasting way of dealing with it and with its vicissitudes. The cosmopolitan bodies of the early modern Caribbean created realms that, despite their transitory nature, cemented a materiality that was novel, mobile, and powerful. Nimble and projective of a circulating creativity, early modern Black ways of knowing shaped the new powerful facts of the New World that flowed through and numerous landscapes of the Caribbean. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. Okay, stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Absolutely fascinating and broad-ranging talk. And so we now do have time for a conversation. And people are welcome either to put their pictures into the chat as well.